going to check this is working. Can you hear us? Excellent. All right. Thank you. I am not Nasar Meer. Our wonderful chair for this evening is unfortunately too ill to be with us. So you have me. My name is Myri. I run Lighthouse, Edinburgh's Radical Bookshop. And I am really just going to be prompting these two to throw us their answers to my myriad questions and then yours. And if you are watching online, we're going to turn on the chat and then you can put in your questions so you can ask those two at the end. I'm going to start by introducing our panel, and after I have introduced them, you can put your hands together for a warm welcome, and then I will hand it over to you two. So to start, Danny Dorling is a social scientist whose books include Inequality and the 1% and All That Is Solid. He is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford and a patron of RoadPeace, Comprehensive Future, and Heeley City Farm. In his spare time, he makes sandcastles. We have Twimukye Macline Mushaka, who works with Shelter Scotland as a lived experience lead with responsibility for coordinating how Shelter Scotland works with people with lived experience of the housing emergency to get their voices heard by people in power and to influence positive change. Previously, Twimukye worked with Poverty Alliance for 15 years as a senior communities and networks officer, with key responsibilities for community engagement on poverty and social exclusion, including facilitating people with lived experience of poverty to participate in the work of the Poverty Alliance. As a disability and minoritised groups activist, Twimukye is passionate about issues of social justice, including highlighting how the intersections of race, religion, gender, and disability compound experiences of disadvantage. She is passionate about how we can harness the power of the seldom heard voices to be agents of change and reduce inequality. In her voluntary role, Twimukye sits on the Consumer Scotland Committee for Consumers in Vulnerable Circumstances and has been on boards in a number of charitable organisations in Scotland. Tonight, however, she speaks to us in a personal capacity. Will you join me in welcoming Danny and Twimukye? So to start us off, I'm going to hand to you first, Twimukye, to introduce your position and your ideas on tonight's theme and around inequality. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair, for having me. Thank you, audience, for coming along. It's a real pleasure for me to be able to speak tonight among esteemed publishers when I'm not even in the slightest close to the subject matter. However, I know the publishers work based on the experience they get. I think I'm worthy of a book if you share, if I share some of the knowledge that I have had. Tonight is also interesting to talk about inequality and poverty in particular. But today, Keir Starmer and his counterpart, Liz Kendall, were saying that they are committed as a government to tackle the bulging welfare bill. That struck me, knowing that we are coming to talk about these issues and to acknowledge the fact that inequality and poverty exist, not because it's inevitable, but because it's man-made. It's man-made from the policies that governments make. It's man-made because of the way the economy and the labor market is structured that keep a few at the top and the majority of us at the bottom of the scale. It's also man-made because people at the bottom of the scale don't have a voice, and that's why I'm keen to make sure that the lived experience of people at the periphery of the inequality ills are heard by policymakers. So in Scotland, we know that 1 in 5 people are in poverty. We know that 1 in 4 children are living in poverty. But there is a glimmer of hope. The Scottish government has demonstrated a clear political will to tackle child poverty in their recent program of government. And this has been going on for the last couple of years. We know the Scottish government has established the Scottish Child Payment, and while we don't have the impact of it, we know that it's helping families that struggle day in, day out to at least put food on the table for their children. When I worked with Poverty Alliance in those years, parents would say how that money helps to buy a worn-out shoe between the academic financial year when the shoes that they bought at the start of the school session have worn out. They also have had a commitment tackling holiday hunger and supporting parents through the No One Left Behind to get onto the labor market. But what struck me today, listening to the DWP secretary, was that we have to get Britain working. And I work with people who say that it's not that they don't want to work, it's because there are so many barriers placed in front of them that they cannot jump. So forcing 40% of people who are not in work because of mental health issues is not going to be a solution if there are no jobs and willing employers that are going to understand that that person needs support to be able to participate in the labor market. We also have to acknowledge that Scottish government, while they are committed to tackling child poverty, we do have a housing crisis. Scottish government recently declared the housing emergency. Many local authorities have declared the housing emergency. We know that 10,000 children in Scotland are trapped in temporary accommodation and homelessness. So you cannot tackle child poverty without addressing the crisis in housing, and therefore there is need for investment in social housing to enable people to make that step. When I work with people with lived experience, they say families that are stuck at the bottom of the scale have dreams for their children. They want to get into work. They also want to give their children a stable home, warm home, because that's the foundation. And we know that unless we tackle adverse childhood experiences, then we are likely to be creating a generation of people that are going to be stuck in poverty and inequality experiences. I will not leave this initial input without talking about the importance of understanding what intersectionality does in creating more values. And we have to understand the intersections of disadvantage in relation to race. We know, according to the recent report on child poverty in Scotland, that 53% of children growing up in poverty are from families from minority ethnic backgrounds. We know that women are more likely to earn less than men, at least 3 times more likely to earn less than men, because they model their work commitments around childcare, around looking after the sick and the elderly. But we also know historically the gender pay gap has been something that has been going on for many years. Also, we have to understand the impact of the intersections of disability and access to the labor market. Evidence suggests that more than 50% of disabled people have a university or a diploma certificate, but that is not translated into the employment opportunities. The skills mismatch in this country is really one of the barriers, again, that we need to look at. And finally, before I leave this, is also about the fact that we need to challenge the debate around wealth redistribution in this country. It's like the systems in place favors those few at the top while widening the gap. We also have to be honest about the role of the media in inflaming public attitude, but also reinforcing the stereotypes about the haves and the have-not, the deserving and undeserving poor. That conversation needs to be had by engaging directly with people with lived experience as well. We also, I think, have to challenge our obsession with economic growth. Because even if we improve economic growth, it doesn't mean that it's going to trickle down equally across the population. And so with those, I'm giving you food for thought and looking forward to your questions and conversation on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Over to you, Danny.
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about Keir Starmer. That was my job. I said the word Keir Starmer, and suddenly a bolt of lightning comes down. Sir Keir, sorry. Sir Keir and not yet Dame Liz, as you started with, and thank you for all of that. Getting the welfare bill down. The largest part of our welfare bill is pensions, and our pension welfare bill is remarkably small. It's small for two reasons. One is that we don't live as long as people in other countries of Europe, and that saves money. And the other is that we pay one of the lowest state pensions, so that saves money. I don't even think it's charitable, I honestly believe this. I don't think Liz Kendall, who came fifth, if you remember, in the leadership election in 2010, or Keir Starmer actually know these things. I don't think they do. If they did, then I would be angrier with them. I don't think they do. I don't think they realise that we have people working 2 or 3 jobs and a very low rate of formal unemployment compared to the past, because you can't live off the money that you're given if you're unemployed. I think they're unaware. The interesting question is, why are they unaware? And naively, somebody like me writes books. So 7 children. It's partly a fiction book. It's designed, please somebody buy this for Christmas for a cabinet minister. Just to try to get through past that barrier of top-end civil service, which of course hasn't changed since the civil servants who were in power under the previous government. Some way of getting past them. I do think the majority of MPs know, because they don't get to see the civil servants, and they don't get to be ministers, because there are too many of them. And half, at least, of the MPs do go to see their constituents on Fridays, or their constituents come to them in their constituency office. And these MPs are representing, for the Labour Party in the South, they're representing the poorest constituencies in Europe now. So I find it hard to think they don't know, but there's a disconnect between those at the top and those at the bottom. Things do change, and they change remarkably, and we're very good at not noticing change. That's one other thing I want to get over, and I won't speak for too long. But let's take 1 in 4 children in Scotland living in poverty. Right, this is a terrible thing, and it is relatively high by European levels, but it is lower than the proportion of children who are living in poverty in the northeast of England, or the northwest, or Yorkshire and Humberside, or Wales, or the West Midlands, or the East Midlands, or the east of England, or the southwest of England, or London, or the southeast of England. The child poverty rate of 1 in 4 in Scotland is now lower than every single English region's child poverty rate. And that's because of a change that occurred over 30 years. Child poverty was worse in the 80s in Scotland in all of the UK. So you do get change, and you can make a change, and people in Scotland primarily have made this change. This wasn't somebody sitting in London going, wouldn't it be interesting to reduce child poverty in Scotland? 1 in 4 is too high, but it's much better than 1 in 3. Right? That dramatically, think of it like a class of children. Okay? 1 in 4 is 7 children in a class. 1 in 3 is about 10. 3 children's lives are different. Only marginally different, right? Just a little bit more. The 7 Children book, about 4 of those 7 children are in effect living in poverty. They're aimed to be representative of Britain. The 4th one, 50p over the official rate per week, makes no difference. When Gordon Brown as Chancellor presided over removing 1 million children from poverty, I suspect hardly any of their families noticed, because they were moved so tinily across the line that the official inequality measure of Britain didn't change 1 iota when that supposedly magnificent thing was done. The only way it couldn't change is if that move was so tiny, involved so little money, that it didn't change our inequality measures. And let's just try and stir you up slightly for later on. Scotland has done interesting things. Quite why, let's be pro-Labour for a minute, I think devolution was absolutely key. I think it was impossible without devolution. The part of Britain which had the most devolution has the most success. You can then argue about why politically or who did it. I don't think it would have been possible without devolution. But I also noticed Gordon Brown claiming that the Scottish Child Payment wasn't efficient. And people in Scotland, including the Labour Party in Scotland, telling him to be quiet. Right? That's what political arguments are about. If you don't want children in Scotland to be poor, those extra 3 in a class of 10, you have to explain to Gordon Brown that he's wrong, which he finds very difficult to accept. Right? Because he was elevated 2 classes at school. It's not his fault. Having a school system... If you're told you're really, really clever at 15, 16, it's very bad for you. Sorry, I'll try and be kind of... Let's... You covered so many things, and I'm failing to. But we may get to them. What I largely do is collect facts, check facts, put facts together in a particular way. Some people don't like what I've done. The 7 Children book had 3 reviews in the same week. The Guardian loved it, of course, but luckily I'd have been upset. The Times Literary Supplement, I think it was, a former SPAD of Michael Gove, not Dominic Cummings, his equivalent, hated it and claimed it was all factually wrong, especially about private schools, which this SPAD seemed to be an expert on, and was wrong, by the way. And David Willits was neutral. Lord Willits, sorry. I don't know if I'm going to start. If I ever use the title of somebody, it's never in their way of being affectionate. Right? Good, yeah. So, 3 reviews of 7 Children. 1 says incredible, 1 says terrible, 1 in the middle, which partly shows where we are as a place. You know, we're the nearest to the United States that you get in Europe. We're not as bad as the US in terms of being so completely split, but we are more split in our views of what's true than other places in Europe, and hence you can have this situation. And lastly, intersectionality, because I always fail to mention this, is the really complicated thing when it comes to numbers, because you have to have enough data to work out what is the added difference of this and this, and it's when it surprises you. So women are paid less than men, have been for a very long time and still are, except under age 30. And that's an intersectionality of being male and under 30 is a disadvantage at the moment when it comes to pay, or being female is an advantage. Why? Because 70% of young women go to university and only 30% of men, and at the moment, graduate jobs still pay a little bit more than non-graduate jobs. But 2/3 of people by age 30 are going to universities, in England at least. You can't have 2/3 of the population being paid more than average. Right? So it's not going to work. But there are all these things where various groupings and logical things come together to mean you can see that we're going in a particular direction that isn't sustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm loving how many note takers we have in the audience, and thank you for the pen. I want to pick up on something that both of you mentioned, which was the Scottish context. So both looking at the Scottish context historically and in the present around inequality. And if I bounce that to you first, Twimukye, and then I'll take it back to you for more specifics, Danny. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Scottish context of inequality as you've seen it?
Yeah, so as I spoke about earlier, I think one positive thing is the commitment that we see as a political will and the close engagement between the third sector and government in attempting to do something. And I take note of what Danny had just said, including I was in a meeting where Gordon Brown said Scottish child payment is not going to lift children out. Yeah, it is not going to lift children out of poverty. But I disagree, because I work with people, with families who have lived experience of a 2-child limit, whereby that little money that comes in under the Scottish child payment helps to put at least food on the table or put electricity on the electric meter, especially now in winter. So there's also been a very collaborative community support to acknowledge that people are in poverty not because of the fault of their own, but because there have been barriers put in front of them. I also had an opportunity to understand the Scottish context from a rural perspective as well, where it costs more to live in rural communities because of access to shops, access to services, public transport, and energy bills as well. But at the end of the day, any poverty, regardless, is bad for all of us. At the end of the day, we all pay for the ills that inequality inflicts on us, whether in terms of poor outcomes from education for young people or health issues. It's already clear that we are spending much longer in our later lives ill and not able to work and being seen as the burden to the NHS. But why have we got there? Because of poverty and inequality. Because the opportunities that would help us to live healthier lives and active lives have been denied to all of us. At the end of the day, as Danny said, it's possible to tackle poverty and inequality if we have the willingness to do so. Thank you.
If I could just follow up, from what you've seen in the work you do and in the spaces that you operate in, are there specific things that for you track for why Scotland would be doing better than other regions down south? Things that we've got right, or things that you've seen anecdotally that are felt in these communities differently?
Yeah, I've touched on some of that. So the Scottish child payment, regardless of what other people might think about it, what we need to think about is making it adequate, because when it started, it was only £25 a week. Child benefit for the second child is only about £13. So that is still a small drop in the ocean, but something that adds value. So campaigners now are working on making sure, if the budget allows, that the Scottish child payment is extended to all children under 18. At the moment, it's under 16. There have been introduction of free bus travel in Scotland for all under 22. Again, that is something that is unique to Scotland. Mm-hmm. And it means that young people can connect, go to different places and learn, because they don't have transport as a barrier. But at the same time, it's not enough to just have a bus pass. Wherever you are going, you need to have something at least to be able to buy something to eat or some form of entertainment. So again, we still need to go a long way in addressing some of that. And then the other thing that perhaps that is useful is the Scottish government has also supported third sector organizations to acknowledge the value and contribution of lived experience. Lived experience is untapped, in my view, in the sense that it's not just about explaining the impact of living in poverty, but it's also for them to contribute to the solutions because they've lived it and they are best placed to work with those that have the power, the gift to change, by contributing the ideas on the solutions as well.
Thank you for that. If I could bounce that to you, that question around this sort of Scottish context, if you want to flesh that out a bit more. No pressure.
Yeah, somebody based in Oxford, speaking in Scotland. If you're an observer, like pretend you're from Mars, something really odd is going on, and it's one of the most interesting divisions in Europe. So, last comment on Gordon Brown. In England, he's on the left, right? Supposedly a more radical Prime Minister left of Blair, even though when he was Prime Minister in 2009, the UK became more unequal than Portugal, the last Western European country. And he'd been Chancellor since 1997, right? He had more responsibility than any other individual for that. But he's still seen in England as this left-wing, pioneering, effective, child poverty reducing, sure start helping Prime Minister and Chancellor. Whereas here, he occupies a different position on the right of the Labour Party, which is to the right often of the SNP and the Greens. We're going to disagree later about it. I reviewed Gordon Brown's... Go back.
And the mic slightly closer to your mouth just so we can...
I reviewed Gordon Brown's latest book, written with two very, very rich men, which I assume was written only for rich people to read. But, if you think Gordon Brown's a hero, just read a review of his... He may not have written it. He may just put his name on the cover. But I suspect he looked at the words. And I highlight the things he says in that book. Why is Scotland different? It's not different in some ways. So if independence was achieved, Scotland would suddenly be so unequal as a Nordic country, you couldn't almost call it Nordic. I mean, the private school system here, it's like to the envy of most southern towns. You keep the special apartheid going. It is remarkable. The bankers, not very far away from where we are now. The inequalities within cities, just going down the Leaf Road to the bottom. It hasn't changed since the 1980s in some ways, other than the worst tenements have been demolished, and in some cases rebuilt, but at least they were demolished. In the 1990s, I used to take photographs of raw sewage going down the sides of people's tenements in Chelston, which didn't happen in the worst parts of Manchester or Liverpool. So something has happened to move Scotland and many of the poorest parts of the poorest cities of Scotland from being at the extreme in the UK to no longer being near the very bottom. Something has happened so that Scottish children have grown taller every year, whereas they haven't in England. Something has happened so that the infant mortality rate, I've forgotten which year it occurred, in Scotland became better than that in England. About a week ago, the latest child mortality figures came out for England. They've risen again. Children are more likely to die than the year before. No reports this time, no news reports. There was hardly any news reports a year ago. The energy's just gone. Right, so we're facing absolute immiseration, which you never thought you would face. There's no need, you can be highly unequal and not have people actually seeing destitution occurring to them. But I don't think that is happening in Scotland, because if you have 3 children under 16 and you claim any form of benefit, the Scottish child payment is now worth more than £4,000 a year. And that didn't exist before the pandemic. So that extra £4,000 a year means at least for children in Scotland, you can't be in destitution because you are materially better off, or it's fighting to keep prices with cost of living crisis, but far, far more children going hungry. The decision that's been made here, within the constraints of the overall funding agreement which Westminster controls, is not to do very much for the old. That is what appears to be the decision. It's a choice of, you've got this much leeway, you can raise taxes this much, maybe a little bit more, maybe not. It's not enough to do what you do in a normal, semi-decent European country, well, not Utopia. In a normal country, Germany, France, the Netherlands, you'd raise a whole lot more money, right? But you're not allowed to do that in Scotland. You're allowed to be a tiny bit decent. What do you do if you're allowed to be a tiny bit decent? You save the children. I wish it was said as explicitly as that. Maybe it is. I think one reason it isn't said explicitly here is that I think there is a quiet agreement between the SNP and Labour not to argue about this one most fundamental thing. Not to, which would be brilliant if it's true and still true. But it does make having a public discussion difficult if the 2 main parties have agreed not to discuss something for the good of children.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's also fair to say that not all is rosy, because we know that welfare is a devolved matter. Sorry, reserved matter.
Just the microphone here.
Scotland is only able to do what they can do within the parameters of their powers. But one thing that has been different has been the commitment to treat carers, for example, adult disability payment, child disability allowance, to treat people with dignity and respect, compared to the punitive approach down in England. So that's one clear difference that I know from the people that I work with. The other element is also the power that Scottish government now has under the Scotland Act to be able to introduce new welfare benefits and interventions without recourse to Westminster. And there is hope that perhaps if we continue to have a good engagement with the government, there could be more things done better to support. And obviously, in as far as education is concerned, when you talk to students in England who have to pay their tuition fees, it's another nightmare. Yeah. At least there is that guarantee that every young person that wants to go to university and have skills, they will be supported in Scotland.
Did you have a response?
Yeah. I know, I can't quite believe. It is incredible. Not only do Scottish children not have to pay tuition fees, but you've got the student loans company based up here. So you make the money out of English, at least the jobs. But I was down near Brighton yesterday at a Labour Party meeting, and it was about what could the government do. And the examples being given were not from Finland or Norway or whatever. The examples for suggested policy were from Scotland, on schools, on exclusions, on the beginning of regulating landlords. You may not think it's great. I've been in situations, I've been in Nordic countries and said, your society is incredible, and people have said, you don't know how terrible it is, which is why it's incredible, because people care. But this is a remarkable situation to be in, of a government in Westminster beginning in effect to fail, or having arguments with rich farmers about their farms, facing the biggest threat from the far right since the 1930s, because Reform did so well at the election, being likely to cause many people to be miserable because what they do won't be enough, even if it is the biggest rise in taxes for so many years and so on.
Can I nudge you back again, Danny?
Yeah, lean back. And at the same time, you don't have to hypothetically say you could try this or this. You just have to say, well, there is a policy that is being tried. It's like the reverse of poll tax. If you remember, poll tax, I think, was introduced early in Scotland. Yes, special vindictiveness for something, right? Yes. So, I do not understand modesty from Scotland, and maybe it's because of the arguments of we need to do more, it's not enough. And because the people who are progressive in Scotland are arguing it's not enough, we do need to do more, they're not helping people in England understand what has been achieved. And the English newspapers are not looking, not reporting, not discussing. And this is a very, very big problem. Because if Scotland became proud of being at the forefront of social policy in the UK, that could be useful for many, many people right across the UK.
Yeah, such an interesting point. I wonder, with this great gap in the net that the state is supposed to provide, that safety net that the state should be giving us, can I ask you to both share your thoughts on the role and limitations of community organizing or civil society in tackling inequality when both of those sets are playing such an important role in filling that gap? If I go to you first, and I'll bounce to you, Danny.
Okay. Thank you again, Miley. Many people in this room will remember when George Osborne introduced austerity and David Cameron's Good Society agenda, that we began, at least in my lifetime, the first time to see the mushrooming of food banks. Our argument at that point was that, okay, this is going to be a short-term solution to the impact of austerity at that time. But it became normalized. We still have people who have to resort to food banks to put food on the table, not because they have not worked hard enough. Some of them are in work. So we have to keep pushing the message that inequality is not the fault of the people that experience it. It's the state deficit. When the welfare state was introduced in 1948, well before, long before I was born, was that it was a safety net that we all have to fall back to at some point in our lives. And social security is not just about social security for people out of work. It includes pensions, it includes any other and in-work support for example, for disabled people who need extra support in order to stay in work. So social security needs to be seen as a wider safety net for investment for our own good. And that it's not for those at the bottom alone. We all use the NHS, for example. Unless you are a millionaire and you want to go private. So we need to have those messaging that is good for investment in social security as a backbone of a better society.
Yeah, so we're at a radical book fair, and I haven't had a chance to look at the books, but I suspect you've got a mixture of books that go from more statist to a little bit less, to maybe a third will be anarchist, I don't know, quite a lot will be green. So this is partly the question of what works. And I think it's easy to confuse what works in an emergency, which is the food banks, which in effect are the recreation of soup kitchens, which we had got rid of between the late 50s and the early 80s. We had none and no need for them. Charity work, which you need more of the more society is falling apart. And things like mutual aid, which are always the hopes of anarchism, that we can get together and do things for each other. But in a way, we can test these things now because we have enough different situations on the European continent that when somebody says, oh, people will all get together and help themselves, well, you can actually test it and see if that's true. If you like, you can call the bluff of the anarchists. Where I stand is sometimes charities are much more effective than I thought they were growing up. I was brought up to not believe in charity, to think it's a terrible thing. The St. Vincent and St. Paul Society, which is a Catholic charity, members of Parliament routinely refer their constituents to it when their cooker breaks. It has a very low budget because it is based on volunteers. It refurbishes furniture and other things and makes sure you can cook your food and have a bed to sleep on. Mm-hmm. Now, it's tragic that we should have to have that, but that is a form of mutual aid, but it's being done through a church. People aren't necessarily doing it because they all want to help each other. For some of them, God's told them to. Now, I don't mind that. I think it helps, but I'm suspicious of the degree to which we do all help. Or, one more example. In the pandemic, the Office of National Statistics ran 86 social surveys, one every 2 weeks. We've never done this with a pandemic before, so it's exciting if you like surveys and you're into pandemics. And one question they asked was, how much will other people help you? And at the beginning of the pandemic, people were very positive about how much their friends and neighbours would help them. But then you could see that begin to fall as the realisation of, well, of course people aren't going to come and knock on your door and say, can I help you, if they're worried that doing that's going to kill them. You know, and we didn't suddenly actually become more generous and nice. In our heads, for a brief number of months, our imaginary neighbours who we didn't know were better people because they were telling us that on TV. And we did create WhatsApp groups at our streets, which were interesting and wonderful. On my street, the question was, that old man who can't get to the shops to get food, he wants 2 bottles of wine every day. And then a little middle-class debate of, honestly, it's a pandemic, let's just buy him 2 bottles of wine a day. So there are good things, people are nice, but I think the state really matters and matters in this way. The state is the only thing that can actually build you a decent number of houses, community house action. It's good if you've got a trust fund, otherwise not. Apologies to people who do that. The state is the only way of organising the education system. I would let people organise their own forest schools, but it's not going to work generally, and the state's the only thing that's going to do healthcare properly and fairly. However, when and where the state does these things best, and not just in Europe but also in Japan, people then become nicer to each other and more communal, less shovey, less greedy, and your anarchist ideas of not needing the police, they work when you've got a strong state. So if you want to see somewhere without many police, go to Finland and watch 6- and 7-year-olds at 10 o'clock at night walk across Helsinki to go to visit their friends with no need for a police force. If you don't want to have a police force, if you want a mutual society that cares, if you want people who look after the allotments and do all of this and volunteer, you need a strong state. And I think these things go together. And because we've had this continuous argument on the radical side of politics between the state and between anarchy, we end up not being that useful in actually looking for the evidence and advocating what works. And you do it empirically by finding those places where children have the best health, where they have the best education, where people are best housed, where there's the least homelessness, and asking, well, what did you do to get that? And that's what we need to do, rather than sit down and imagine a utopia and say that hunter-gatherers lived like this so that we could too. That isn't useful.
Love a cynic. I have one more question, and then I'm going to throw it out to you, which is around lived experience. So how it's taken into account in a search for solutions, effectively or ineffectively, who is actually listening for those lived experiences? And I'm going to punt to you first and then ask you around research.
So one thing that I wanted to add to the conversation to the previous question was that the civil society, the community-based organizations do an important job of bridging the gap between people's real-life experiences and managing the state deficit. And what do I mean by that? Can you imagine what someone who doesn't know how the welfare system works without the support of Citizens Advice Bureau to navigate a complex welfare system? Can you imagine someone that has presented homeless without the support of Shelter and Shelter Scotland to navigate the process of accessing temporary accommodation and eventually permanent homes? So lived experience, in my perspective, does not work in a vacuum. It has to be in relation to the issues at hand and the need for the intervention that we are taking for. But I just want to give examples where lived experience has been helpful. As I mentioned, the good practice from Scottish Government, Poverty and Inequality Commission has experts by lived experience panel, which is populated by people with lived experience of poverty and inequality. And in their scrutiny role, they are able to challenge the government on what works and that doesn't work. So that is a positive thing. Some local authorities have also begun to consider the consultation process, meaningful consultation, not tokenism, to address some of the more complex issues around intersectionality, for example, about how disabled people, for example, can be supported to get onto the labor market. Lived experience is not just a talking shop. It's a process. It has to be facilitated. There has to be an agenda that is set by the authorities, the people that have the gift to make a difference, but also have the commitment to listen to the people with lived experience in order to have a co-production approach to finding solutions. And we, in Scotland, that's one of the things that we are perhaps more ahead as well, in as far as facilitating participation and meaningful participation being emphasized. And to some extent, where there is a budget, people do not offer their time for nothing. They get a small token of appreciation in terms of vouchers. Sometimes those who are able to work and can get a cash payment, they are, because the framework for participation acknowledges that the skills of people with lived experience is valuable in finding important solutions.
Thank you. Danny.
That example, the Inequality and Poverty Commission in Scotland and the lived experience, if you contrast it to the longer established one in England, the differences are shocking. When the one in England, it was called Child Poverty and Social Mobility, I think. And then they got rid of the child poverty bit. And it just became social mobility. It went through numerous chairs. It doesn't have people who've experienced things being asked anything at all. In the latest incarnation, it's the head teacher of that weird school in London was head, but she resigned. So the poor second in command has had to try and keep it going. Now, this is a commission presiding over many years over the worst record in Europe, producing a report every year, which I read, which now only includes one international graph, which is wrong, because they told somebody to find one graph in which we're not the worst. And they found one. But if you read page 70, and it's in that, if you read page 70 of the report the graph came from, it said, oh, by the way, this doesn't actually work for the UK. You've got to look at it by age 40. Right? Now, the contrast between inviting people in Scotland who've got a clue, and clearly in England, not only not inviting anybody in who knows what they're talking about, but instructing your researcher to try to find something which is not representative, it is stunning. What I want us to do is to get to a point which we were at before. So if you take the introduction of the health service, the minister who introduced the health service had lived experience of absolute poverty, lived experience of his parents having lost many of his brothers and sisters as children, lived experience of what it was like not to be able to pay the doctor a penny and watching somebody die. That made him incredibly effective as a health minister. His partner, she was even more effective as Jenny about things, because this wasn't a woman explaining to men about what it felt like to be a woman. This was a woman MP, right? And you need to get to a position where your minister who's dealing with disabilities has lived with a disability all their life, rather than having a well-meaning person. Not necessarily always not matching, but that is what gets you into a situation which is better. Or the last example from Finland, I do like Finland, having a prime minister, Social Democratic Party, not the left party, the one I like, in the middle. Well, not only could she dance, but having a prime minister who had been brought up in poverty herself, with a single mother at one point, means you don't have to have somebody explain to her what it's like, because that's your prime minister. But it also shows you your country has changed at that point, that the thing they could most complain about her was the fact that she was dancing at a party once, if you remember the pictures. But we are so divided that we are going to have to go through several decades, no matter what happens, of talking to each other and explaining what different lives are like, because our lives are more parallel than the lives of people in Britain have been for decades and decades, and on the continent. So that is why recounting actual lived experiences and differences matters more here and now than anywhere else. Purely empirical. And it's possible to get to a situation where the difference between people's lives is so much narrower. They never go away, but they at times have been so narrow, and the mixing of social groups then is so high that most people have relatives, if not themselves, who've experienced things. I particularly worry about children. We are bringing our children up not to mix with each other. And it's not just the ones where we're paying them, literally paying the money so they don't mix with other children, for a better education. Right? Nobody should be allowed to say those words without shame. Literally paying for them not to mix. But we have as much segregation within the state sector by segregation by house price. And this creates a society that is ignorant of itself, and one where you're not going to be able to cure that quickly. It takes 2 or 3 generations to get yourself out of that situation. The one to end on this, or a slightly trite example, D.H. Lawrence's book, Lady Chatterley's Lover, was, 1920s when it was banned, about a woman, a lady, and a gardener who weren't supposed to mix, let alone make love. When the book was finally allowed to be published in the 1960s, the judge had led such a parallel life that he said to the jury, "Is this a book you would like your wives or servants to read?" The jury were mainly made up of men, but they sniggered and said yes. Right? Because by the 60s, people didn't have servants anymore. So if you think about lived experience and a servant, you'd have had to find somebody who had been a servant to say what it felt like. Right? And that's when you eventually succeed. And we only now know from old surveys. My favourite survey about servants is when people were asked about what job they'd like their children to do, and nobody wanted their child to be a servant, because as a servant you can't have children. And if you think about our society today, think about what people are working in jobs or situations or towns or having to share houses with strangers so they can't have children. And if you like, we have a new servant class again. It's just not so obvious.
Thank you for that really cheering final thought before I throw it to the audience. Also, I love that you have a favorite survey about servants, yes. Which is assuming you have one you don't like. All right. Do we have questions in the audience? Brilliant. JJ is going to bring you a microphone. Keep your hands in the air so they can find you. There we go. So we got 1, 2, and then we'll take it to the back. If we do, yeah, go for it. If I can ask you just to pull your mask down so we can see your mouth, and then go for it, and as loud as you can.
Great. Thank you so much.
A little louder would be great.
All right.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for this talk. It's been really interesting to hear your thoughts. Some people say that as austerity was introduced and the government started stripping away the public services that were being offered and charities stepped in, charities that were very effective at helping people, the government has kind of seen that and then has avoided reinstating the support that they were providing before because they're like, well, the charity can do it and can do it well. Do you think this is a problem that we're facing here in Scotland? And if so, how do we combat it?
So this was a question that was around whether or not, so charities were so effective that the state no longer has the pressure to reintroduce
welfare measures, or the state would like to believe that the charities are so effective.
Or the state's quite happy to leave it to other people. Do you have thoughts about that interplay of where the state should step in or where it doesn't have the pressure to step in anymore because of civil society?
No, I think civil society itself, there because of the state deficit, they are doing the job that the state should have been doing in the first place. And it's also not very easy in terms of funding and keeping civil society afloat. We've seen so many folding down because of lack of funding as a result of austerity. Some of the smaller community organizations who used to get funding from local authorities have also been folding in the last few years. So it should be the other way around. It should be civil society challenging the state to do more and eventually narrowing that need for civil society. But I think looking at it also, there is the whole question of accountability and demanding for that accountability. And without the civil society, the state will not be accountable for their actions.
Interesting. Go for it, Danny.
Yeah. I've never seen a study done, but it'd be interesting. Of what
a little
things,
louder, if you don't mind.
what things are always done by charity? I suspect things to do with animals are, and certainly people spend more money on animals than children for charities. But at times when the state is in places when it's properly funded, you should not need the state to be involved in any way with charity to be involved in healthcare in any way. And then there'll be intermediate things. One thing that I worked in housing quite a lot, and one thing that worries me is we now have a homeless industry. It's enormous. You can go through, I won't name the charities, but you can go through their public accounts and see their turnover. The majority of the money goes to middle-class salaries every year. And although it may be subconscious, this is an industry. It is possible to eliminate homelessness. We did it in the late 1940s. There were counts around London where they couldn't find homeless people, remarkably because we had the bombing from the Luftwaffe that just occurred. Okay, but we had an idea of solidarity back at the end of the Second World War that, of course, you find somewhere for people to sleep because so many people had been homeless and made homeless. The country in Europe where, and they get very annoyed if I say no homelessness, so they have 6 people. They know who they are. They change every week or so, but only 6. There, which is Finland, there, how are they held to account? They're held to account partly because this is seen as an international success, and that helps publicly. They're held to account by the political party that led this, which was the party of the left. But you're right, the danger is it can slip. Joseph Rowntree, if you know the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the purpose was that Joseph's father set up the soup kitchen in York around about 1850. Joseph saw that the soup kitchen wasn't working. Joseph ran the chocolate factory and set his son on a foundation with a job of doing whatever it would take to ensure that there wasn't a soup kitchen in future. And there wasn't by 1952. So in 100 years, you go from setting one up to getting rid of one. Admittedly, through a charitable trust, funding the research, but it's independent. The last thing I'll say, the charitable sector, I think, can be useful as a test for is the state good enough. So in the best countries in Europe, you still have charity private schools. It's just that they're incredibly rare, but if your state system became bad, you'd be able to tell because they would grow. So I wouldn't ban charities, I wouldn't ban private schools. They can show you different ways of doing things. There are niches where they could be useful. But other than for animals, where I really don't think the state needs, certainly not in the UK, where the state really needs to help animals that much. Other than for animals, I think the state should be taking responsibility for anything that you think actually really matters.
We are running slightly over time, so I'm conscious that we had quite a few questions. Fortunately, Danny is able to stick around and sign books and answer whatever questions you have afterwards. Twimukye has somewhere to go afterwards, so we're going to take one more burning question and give a brief answer, and then we're going to wrap it up, and you can catch Danny afterwards. And if you have any questions that you had for her that you didn't get a chance to ask, then I will send on an email and we'll have a chance to follow up. So, very quickly, the last question. Whoever is holding the microphone, it's you. Go for it.
Okay, I'll try and keep this one quick. One other thing that separates Scotland from the rest of the UK, and something which separates the UK from the rest of Europe, is proportional representation. As I'm sure you all know, we have an incredibly strange parliament. Labour won a very small amount of the vote, yet gets 100% of the power for 5 years. Do you think that having something more akin to the German or Icelandic or Finnish or any other European country's political system would help with reducing inequality in some way?
So the question was whether or not a different political system, based on the proportional representation that we have in the UK, whether a different political system would be the answer to the inequality that we have. If I bounce to you first, and then on to you, Danny.
Well, the work I do, we don't engage in preference for any political system, but I guess if there was an opportunity for people to have a choice on what kind of political system we want for Scotland, then that's an interesting opportunity to pursue. We have to analyze the deficit of the current political system and see whether whatever we are proposing to replace it with would give us a better result. For me, as a person, I also feel that the current political system is not balanced enough in terms of representation of people that look like me, in terms of representation of disabled people. I know that we have only the first MSP who is a disabled person, and she is incredible, but we could have many more voices. And as I said that, I just remembered that when I became a young activist soon after leaving university, one of the things we used to say was nothing should be for us without us. And that's what representation is about, having that space to have different voices of representation. Also, there is one of the things that the people I work with talk about is that when others speak for you, you lose the greatest part of the argument because they are speaking for you, you have no say. But if you are speaking for yourself and others that are like you, then there is value in having that voice. And finally, also is to acknowledge that tackling inequality is possible. It requires a multifaceted response, whether in terms of the political system, the way the economy is structured and the labor market, and the way communities work, and the way those that are disadvantaged by certain characteristics are supported to overcome those barriers, are responded to. With those, I leave you to continue with the rest of the conversation, and Danny, I'll hold you into having my book. Yeah. Okay, thank you for having me.
No, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to escort Twimukye off. You can
carry
answer
on.
that question.
Right, you know I'm going to take that length of time, don't you? Thank you. Lovely to meet you. Okay. PR. I think we'll get it in my lifetime in the UK. And of course, we have it in every devolved and separate. You know, nobody in their right mind introduces what we have anywhere new. The countries with the most fair systems have the best outcomes. The United States had its outcome partly because it has such a bad system. The question is, what's it going to take? Now, we do alter our voting systems. It's been a long time. But, you know, we do let men without property vote, and then grudgingly we let women over 30 vote, and then eventually women over 18 vote as well. And then we didn't do it to the 60s for Northern Ireland, so it's actually more recent that we've had the system we celebrate that produced so many Labour MPs with fewer votes than in 2019. I think what it will take will be Kemi Badenoch getting together with Nigel Farage, quietly making a deal, keeping it secret, and then 6 months before the election, you discover that in some constituencies you have a Conservative candidate, and in some you have a Reform candidate. And then you will have it shown to you what's wrong with first past the post. Right? But it's very, very risky. The most unequal countries in the 1930s in the rich world were Germany and Japan. Right? Inequalities make people desperate. They vote, including your middle class, because the middle class feel in some ways are poor when you're very unequal. They vote all over the place, desperately reaching for any straw that will get them out of their situation. Because even though most people absorb the message, which is, if you're not rich, you haven't tried hard enough, it's your vote, secretly within yourself, you don't completely believe it, and secretly within yourself at the ballot box, you can do what you like. And if they've told you that you're like this, 90% of the people are living on 60% of GDP, and you don't like it, and then we have Labour in office for 4 years, with more MPs than they've had in decades, not improving your life, but giving you a kind of Biden message of, hey, we've done the economy really well. Don't you know, we've had 2.3% GDP growth per year, as opposed to some G7 member country. I mean, it's almost enough to make me vote for Kemi, right? I'm partly joking, but I think the most likely way we're going to get PR is a national disaster of an authoritarian government led by those two people. And Scotland needs to think what it's going to do in those circumstances and what's allowed under international law. But you get these moments. We could avoid this. We could avoid it if enough people in Labour realise that this is a possibility. Labour folk in the ground in England know they're in danger of losing local seats in council elections next summer to, in effect, reform candidates or independent candidates. The danger is that the dinner party going folk in SW1, just at the very top of the party, right, the ones whose parents are directors of donkey sanctuaries and so on, don't mix with the rest and are blind to this and feel they're such a success that they walk us into that disaster. They're talking about House of Lords reform in the second half of this Parliament. They should be thinking about introducing PR now with a huge majority. They could do it because of the clear and present threat of the most unequal country in Europe, with the biggest rise in child poverty of all of Europe just occurred, doing what has just occurred in the United States of America. And that should be foremost in their minds, as this could be the legacy. You associate the word Keir Starmer and the word Rachel Reeves with the introduction of a far-right national government. That's what they need to be thinking about above everything else, because they didn't go into politics for that. Whatever they went in for, it wasn't for that. And we need to say, this is a danger. It's a danger. Because it is, not to try and get what we want, but because it's an actual, real danger to the United Kingdom and every part of it. More than I think you can say it's a danger in other European countries, when their equivalent at the far right is really soft compared to ours. You have to remember the Conservative Party left the European People's Party in 2014 and allied with Alternative for Deutschland. So our Conservative Party in 2014 were far right. They then moved further to the right under Liz Truss and Sunak, who did Britannia Unchained. Kemi is in that group, who's currently leading them. That's further to the right than they were. And Reform are even further to the right than that. Right? This is an extreme situation which, because of a bit of English civility, opening doors, wearing cufflinks and holding a mug of beer, doesn't make it look as it actually is. I don't want to depress you, but if you want to see PR quick, it's a much stronger reason for PR than going, oh, we've worked out the maths and it's ever so much fairer. It is a strong reason for doing things, is that first past the post is the most likely way in which we're going to get the most extreme political parties in Europe. It's not me saying that, it's the Financial Times. The most extreme political parties in Europe in control of everything.
And on that, on that very cheerful note, thanks, Danny. That's all we have time for. Danny is sticking around for a wee bit and will be signing books. And if you didn't get to ask a question, he can answer that over at the signing table, and you can listen in to his answers to other people's questions. And to everyone online, thank you for watching, and I'm sorry that we didn't get to the online questions. But we will, yes, this is your last chance also to have a look at tables, because very soon anything that is left on them will be inside a box. But will you join me finally in just putting your hands together and thanking Danny Dorling for being with us to close the fair?